Hello, and thank you for joining me for Storytime with Mr. C. I am Mr. C, and if you are one of my regular listeners at this point, welcome back. If this is the first time you have tuned in, well, welcome to the show. If you like what you hear, please go check out my first 9 episodes. Here on Storytime with Mr. C, I will be sharing stories that I have written, or a friend or family member has written, or maybe even something you have written. If you would like for me to share one of your stories here on Storytime with Mr. C, get your story or stories ready to go and shoot me an email at storytimewithmisterc@gmail.com. I have also put the email down in the description for you. For now, I'm going to ask that you please keep your stories to a maximum of 2,000 words, and please, for now, keep them family friendly. And maybe, just maybe, I will read one or more of your stories in the near future. As always, a big thank you to my buddy Russ for helping me out with my intro music. Russ is the bassist for local band Drive By High Five. If you get the opportunity to check them out, please do so. And also, as always, a big, huge thank you to Ben over at Chasing the Whimsy. You can find the link to his podcast down in the description. Please go check that out and show him some love. Thank you, Ben, still and forever, so much for your support, sir. I sincerely appreciate all that you do. All right, folks, so this is kind of an exciting episode because this is episode number 10. And for this momentous occasion, I have a couple of groovy things to share. First, I have been wanting to do this for a while, and I figured the release of my 10th episode was a good time for it, so I am officially branching out to other platforms. Thus far, my podcast has only been available on Spotify, but as of today, you can also find Storytime with Mr. C on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and YouTube Music, and maybe more as I get things moving. So please tell all of your people to look for Storytime with Mr. C on any and all of those platforms. The other groovy thing I have for you today is my next spooky story. That's right, folks, spooky story number 2. I feel the first one was more sad than spooky, but it had some blood and guts. The second one, no blood and guts, and probably less sad, but I think the spooky level is a little bit higher. Hopefully. We'll see. Let me know. And for those of you who don't care as much for the spooky, do not fret. Father Allen will be back next week. All right, folks, enough babbling. Here we go with episode 10. Stand by.
Storytime with Mr. C.
Storytime.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of Storytime with Mr. C. This is my second spooky story. This one is called Behind Every Smile. Elliott woke with a start. He inhaled sharply as he sat upright, but moved way too fast, and a small ping went off somewhere in his lower back. "Son of a bitch," he muttered as his body settled back into the sofa. He had been dreaming again. Something about a bird that was flying over him while he ran. It cast a huge shadow, and then the shadow moved like it was alive. There was a face somewhere in the shadow, but not anyone he thought he knew. And then there was wind and a howling sound. And then he woke up, and now he sat, alone, in the darkness of his home, the only light coming from the old television sitting across from him. A man who seemed way too happy with himself moved enthusiastically across the screen, arms waving way too much, emphasizing the immense value of whatever useless thing he was selling. This was the time of night Elliott hated. Nothing that mattered was ever happening during this chunk of the 24-hour cycle. People were either asleep, or wishing they were asleep, or otherwise existing only as non-contributors to the greater good. Elliott fished for the remote, patting the blankets and pillows to either side of him, reaching his arthritic fingers between the cushions. Where in the holy hell? He spotted the item for which he searched. It had fallen off the couch again and lay on the carpet, close enough for him to reach, but far away enough to be a pain in the ass. Elliott stared at the remote for way too long, until finally giving way to the fact that he still couldn't move stuff with his mind. He exhaled and leaned forward. Using his left arm for support, he reached with his right. A massive groan leaked out of him as he stretched as far as his body would let him. His fingers finally closed around the device, and he dragged/pushed himself back up into a sitting position. He closed his eyes again as he inhaled and exhaled with some effort. He contemplated the fact that he had nearly died just from picking up the remote, and he descended just a bit further into his depression. Getting old is horse crap, he said to himself. Sick of this garbage. He slowly opened his eyes back up to find that Sarah had joined him. Hi, Elliott, she said, her lips parting just enough to barely expose her top teeth. Hi yourself, sweet thing, he answered back, showing just a bit of his own teeth, but not too much. He hated his teeth. Misaligned and stained, the fifth one back on the left was gone. But he loved Sarah's. Sarah stood in the doorway leading to the kitchen, her lavender housecoat moving in a non-existent breeze. You look tired, Elliott. I am, he replied. More so every day. Sarah nodded and continued to smile. Why don't you come on over and have a seat? Elliott offered as he patted the couch to his right. Sarah continued to smile, but did not move from her spot in the doorway. You look tired, Elliott. Yup, he chuckled. Still am. You know you'd be more comfortable if you just... You look tired, Elliott. Elliott's smile started to fade from his face as he looked up at his wife. You look tired, Elliott, she repeated again. And then again, and again, she continued with these same 4 words over and over, picking up speed until it morphed into a sort of white noise that poured from her smiling face. Her head dropped and tilted to one side, but the sound continued. Elliott let the remote fall from his hand as he covered his ears. Sarah's body seemed to buckle and collapse as a shape moved behind her in the dark. The shape stretched to its full height, filling the doorway as it moved forward, pushing Sarah before it. It was humanoid and black as pitch, shiny slick with a revolting moisture. It hoisted Sarah into the air as her body went limp and proceeded to slide her off the end of its long, talon-like fingers. The Sarah puppet collapsed in a boneless heap as the shape oozed further into the room. Elliott stared as a hole opened in its face, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The needles separated, and it spoke.
You look tired, Elliott.
Elliott's head snapped up and another ping sounded in his back. He exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for days and then looked down at his empty hand. Something was just there. He shifted his focus to see the remote lying on the carpet between the couch and the coffee table. He cursed its existence as he scanned the room. He was alone. Of course he was alone. He'd been alone for 11 years, ever since Sarah... Why was he suddenly thinking about Sarah? He didn't like to. Only made him sad. He reached down and after an extended struggle was finally able to grab hold of the remote. He pointed it at the television where a man gestured wildly at some kitchen gadget atrocity. A huge smile smeared across his pixelated face. The volume increased as the man hollered about the mind-blowing deal he had, and Elliott settled in for another restless night. Water poured from an unseen source. It flowed over surfaces and passed through trenches carved out of the earth. It dripped and pooled and never grew still. color reflected off the surface, a kaleidoscope of blues and greens, reds and purples. Something moved under the surface. It stretched out and infected the cool liquid, turning it a murky gray with splashes of hollow nothingness. The water slowed and thickened like tar. It pushed its way through the wall and into his eyes, clogging his vision, and Elliott's eyes fluttered open and he gasped for a breath. Once he found it, he inhaled deeply and filled his lungs. Where was he? And who was making all that damn noise? He creaked his way up into a sitting position as his world took shape around him. He was still on the sofa, his blankets wrapped partially around his legs. The room was filled with a strange kind of light, enough so that Elliott could see, but still soft and gloomy. What time was it? The noise was coming from the television. Some cartoon nonsense with a bird and a pig. They were singing, and it was way too loud. Elliott scanned his surroundings for a way to make the noise stop, and realized he was clutching something in his hand. The remote. For once, a lucky break. He thrust it forward and pushed the down arrow. Nothing. He pushed the down arrow again. Still, nothing. Piece of crap! He hurled the remote at the television, but it didn't quite make it, and instead clattered to the carpet. Elliott sighed and started to unwrap himself from his blankets. After a brief fight with the linens, he pushed himself from the sofa and into a standing position. When was the last time he had stood up? He steadied himself on the arm of the sofa until his legs came back to life. Only then did he begin shuffling out from behind the coffee table. He slowly and painfully made his way across the carpet, and what the hell was that ringing noise? It sounded like a familiar tune, but Elliott couldn't quite place it. Where was the volume knob on this damn TV? The bird and pig continued singing and had been joined by a sheep. And there's that ringing noise again. And now a knocking? Who was making all this noise? The knocking, again, as if it was the front door. Someone was at the front door. Elliott shifted his focus and moved for the front door. Who would be at his door at this time of night? Another light knock. I'm coming, damn it! Elliott turned the deadbolt, grabbed the knob, and pulled the door open. Standing just outside, a hood covering its face, was a small figure. Liquid dripped from its shiny body and pooled at its feet as it lifted its head to Elliott. Hi, the little girl said from under the hood of her shiny pink rain jacket. Elliott stared and processed this new information. Was it raining? Is that why it was so gloomy and gray? The girl smiled without showing her teeth, but slowly dissolved into discomfort. What time is it? Elliott asked, louder and grumpier than he intended. It's breakfast time, mister. What do you want? Oh, my mama just sent me to see if you had some sugar. Were you sleeping? No. Oh, it looks like you were sleeping. Well, I wasn't. And I don't have any sugar. Bye now. Elliott started to close the door. But she's making pancakes, and we don't have any sugar. She just needs a little bit, the little girl said, the smile creeping back to her face. Please? Elliott stopped the door just short of closing. What's your name? He asked. My name is Sarah. Elliott jerked the door open and looked intently at the stranger who had appeared on his doorstep. What did you say? The smile left the girl's face once again as she took a step back. Laura. My name is Laura. Laura Marie Trenton. Elliott steadied himself and looked at the child's face. He didn't want to scare the little girl. I can check the kitchen and see if maybe there's some in the pantry somewhere, he said, trying to soften his temper. He carefully stepped away from the door and shuffled through the living room. He made it as far as the kitchen doorway, but stopped and turned. Laura had stepped further onto the stoop, but remained outside, sheets of rain falling behind her. Well, said Elliott, you should probably come inside. You'll melt out there. Laura stood thinking and then took a couple steps, leaning her head just inside the doorway. Her eyes scanned what she could see of the dimly lit space, and then she slowly stepped over the threshold. Don't touch anything, Elliott grumbled as he entered the kitchen. The place was relatively uncluttered, but not clean. Elliott didn't really clean anything other than himself, and that was only once in a while. Laura's voice sounded from the living room. "What are you watching?" "Nothing," Elliott hollered back as he opened the pantry door. "It's really loud," Laura yelled over the sound of the singing animals. Elliott scooted the soup and beans from one side of their shelf to the other. He found an ancient box of rotini pasta, and as he became lost in the label, he noticed a change in the air. He stomped back to the doorway, pasta in hand, and glared at Laura, who now stood in front of the television. "I said not to touch anything." "It was too loud," Laura responded, her eyes not moving from the flickering screen. She held the remote in her tiny little hand and watched intently as a chicken and maybe a goat danced a little jig as they painted a fence. Elliott harumphed and returned to his search. He placed the pasta back on its shelf, moved some green beans, and finally found what he was looking for. "There you are, you little bastard." Elliott snatched the mason jar, stepped back, and closed the door of the pantry. He turned and nearly dropped the jar as he jumped out of his skin. Laura stood in the doorway, smiling. "Jesus, child! Shouldn't sneak up on folks, especially not when they're my age." "Oh, you can't be that old," Laura chimed. "How old are you?" "Older than you think," Elliott scoffed as he set the mason jar on the little table in the center of the room and started rummaging through a drawer. "And how old are you, Miss Laura?" "Older than you think," she said as she smiled and wandered further into the kitchen. "What are you doing, mister?" Elliott pulled a sandwich baggie and spoon from the drawer and returned to the table. "I found your sugar," he said as he groaned his way into a chair. "But you can't have the whole jar. Gonna put some in a baggie for you. How much?" "I don't know." "How much do you need for pancakes?" Laura asked as she joined him at the table. "Hell if I know. Probably a cup or so." Elliott tried to get the lid off the mason jar, but his hands would not cooperate. Laura watched for a moment and then held out her hands. "Oh, you think you can open it? Be my guest." Elliott chuckled as he passed the jar to Laura, and with a quick twist and a pop, she had it opened in a flash. She giggled as she returned the jar to its owner. "I'm stronger than you think, too," she proclaimed as Elliott snatched the mason jar from the girl's hands and sniffed its contents. "Show off," he grumbled, as he began the task of transferring sugar from the jar to the baggie. Laura grinned as she slid off the chair and began meandering around the kitchen. "You just move in?" Elliott asked as he scooped sugar. "No," Laura answered. "We've been here a while." She had stopped to admire the figurines that sat on the windowsill above the sink. "Down in the Clark's old place, the greenhouse?" "No. These are pretty." Laura gestured to the figurines. "Don't touch those. You'll break them." Elliott put the lid back on the mason jar and began fighting with the sandwich bag. The sound of the refrigerator door opening made him turn. "What the hell? Get out of there!" Laura stared into the icebox. "I'm just looking," she said, as she surveyed the empty refrigerator shelves and the freezer stuffed with frozen dinners. "You must really like Salisbury steak?" "I like it just fine," Elliott snapped. "Come do this damn thing." He held up the baggie as Laura closed the refrigerator and skipped back to the table. She snatched the bag and zipped it closed in one swift movement. "Is this my sugar?" "No, it's my sugar. I'm just letting you borrow it. Where's your house?" "Now Mama can make our pancakes. Do you like pancakes, mister?" "No. Where do you live?" "Mama puts blueberries in hers. I don't like blueberries." "Laura," Elliott interrupted. "Which house do you live in? I know you don't live on either side of me, and you're not in the Clark's place." Laura grinned at Elliott as she absent-mindedly played with the sugar-filled bag in her hands. "Who's Sarah?" she asked, keeping her eyes locked on Elliott's. "What did you say?" Elliott stammered as he stared back at the girl. "Sarah. Who is she? You said her name." Laura's grin crept further up her rosy cheeks. Without breaking eye contact, Elliott stood from his chair. "I think it's time for you to go." "No," Laura replied. "I think I'll stay." Elliott stomped to the kitchen doorway and pointed firmly towards the front door of the house. I don't know what you're up to, little girl, but you need to get the hell out of my house. Elliott stared at the figure wrapped in the little pink rain jacket, but it did not move. He could feel the pressure rising in his chest, and his breathing became ragged. Without turning, the girl spoke. You're looking awfully tired, Elliott. Elliott stopped breathing for a second, coughed, and tried to collect himself. What did you say? So very tired, Laura said as she stood and turned to face Elliott. A smile still stretched across her face. Elliott couldn't move. He could barely breathe. Was this another dream? It didn't feel like he was dreaming, but how could he be sure? Who are you? Elliott asked. I already told you, the little girl answered. I'm Laura, and I'm here to borrow some sugar from my mommy. She held up her baggie of sugar and wiggled it. You got your damn sugar. Take it and go. I don't think I will, Laura said, her face twisting into a frown. I don't want any sugar from some mean old man. She hurled the bag against the far wall where it exploded, sending sugar across the kitchen. Elliott stood up straight, trying to appear strong. Get out of... No, Laura snapped. I'm not done with you yet. The smile returned to her face as she advanced on the old man. Elliott backed into the living room as fast as his feet would carry him, but stumbled as his leg hit the corner of the coffee table, sending him toppling onto the sofa. He looked up to see Laura standing in the kitchen doorway, but in a flash, she was standing over him. Leave me alone, Elliott stammered. I haven't done anything to you. I know, Laura said. Doesn't really matter. It's more of a right place at the right time kind of situation. Elliott tried to sit up from the sofa, but Laura's hand was suddenly at his throat, and he was pushed back with a force that defied the physics of her tiny frame. Elliott struggled to move, but the small, slender fingers wrapped tighter around his neck, cold and vice-like against his sad flesh. Don't even try, Laura said as she leaned closer to Elliott's face. It's just pathetic. Almost makes me sad, but whatever. Elliott raised his hand to retaliate, but the girl swatted it away, snapping the old man's wrist with a sickly crack. Elliott could only whimper. I told you, Laura said as she shook her head. That was your fault. And why are you even fighting this? It's not like you've got a lot going for you. Go to hell, Elliott spat. Jeez, you really are mean. All right, let's get this over with. Laura leaned her head back and opened her mouth wide as if yawning. Moist, clicking sounds came from her face as she slowly rolled her head from side to side. What the hell? Was all Elliott could whisper as he watched the little girl writhe and twitch. With a guttural exhale, she whipped her head back down and brought her face close to Elliott's. He could feel her breath, thick and humid, against his cheek.
We are gonna have such fun together,
Laura said, as she increased the pressure on Elliott's throat. She lifted her face, and Elliott could see that her skin had become dark and splotchy, her eyes ink-black and hollow, and her teeth. Her smile opened impossibly wide to reveal they had become long and sharp, much like needles. Elliott felt himself drifting as Laura began to cackle. His lungs emptied, but his ears filled with her laughter. The edges of his world pushed inward, and the darkness of the little girl's eyes flowed into his own, and the rest was silence. Andy shifted in his seat as he completed another row, and the little brightly colored candies shifted down the screen. He was totally rocking this level. The chime went off, indicating that a guest had entered through the front door. Welcome to the gas and grub, he mumbled with just the right amount of apathy. Hi, said a tiny voice. Can you help me, mister? Andy looked up to see that a young girl was now on the other side of his counter, her blonde hair in braids and her Hello Kitty t-shirt looking very worn. Andy was not used to getting many customers way out here, especially not little girls, and especially not at 2 o'clock in the morning. How can I help you? He asked, his voice tired and out of practice. How much further is Tucson? The smiling child asked. Are we almost there? Andy prepared to answer, but was interrupted by another chime from the front door. Welcome to Gas and Grub, he said automatically, and the voice of a second stranger responded. Why, thank you kindly. Hey, Laura, did you find us some help? The voice's owner appeared from around the beef jerky display. An older man with bright eyes and a well-manicured beard stepped up behind the little girl and placed his hand on her shoulder. This is my Grandpa Elliott, the little girl said, smiling up at Andy. He sure is glad we found you, mister. You bet I am, Grandpa Elliott replied. I'm starving. Andy couldn't help but stare as a smile stretched across the old man's face. Andy had never seen such perfect teeth. Thank you so much for joining me for this 10th episode of Storytime with Mr. C. That was Behind Every Smile, the second of my spooky stories. So, what'd you think? How was it? More spooky, less spooky? Drop me a comment or an email. Let me know what you thought, folks, please. Next week, I will be back with more Father Allen as I share our 10th chapter from the collection of stories I wrote about my father. That episode will be available on Sunday, September 14th, so please come on back for that one. In the meantime, go check out Ben's podcast, Chasing the Whimsy, and be on the lookout out there for Drive-By High Five, folks. Hey, thanks again for hanging out and listening to my story. I hope you come on back for the next one. Until then, take care, be safe.